Enjoyed it. I'll leave you to it. Go well.
Okay, we're waiting for George to come in.
Can you see me, Joe?
I can see you. No, I could see you. Now I cannot. There you are. How are you, George?
You can see me. I can see you. Good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm quite okay. Quite okay. I'm curious to learn more about your background. You may have you've been on this vigil several times before, but some people have never tuned in before. Tell me everything you can about yourself in the next half an hour. No, I'm kidding. In the next minute or so.
I was born in Hungary, and I came to England when I was a young boy. And so I grew up and was educated in London. And then I came to the United States, and I spent some time in journalism in the 80s, well, yeah, in the late 80s and 90s, in what I think at that time were kind of conservative publications,
such as
the American Spectator. I wrote for, and I even wrote for some things in the neocon publications such as Commentary, the National Interest, and then as I grew increasingly disenchanted with that world, kind of moved into other areas. And for me, I think that the turning point was the end of the Cold War and the sudden transformation of what was supposedly just the anti-communist cause into a super American empire dominant over everyone else cause. And it was a sort of a seamless transition from people who were supposedly only concerned with this one thing, which was to thwart Soviet expansionism, to thwart communism, suddenly became the new agenda, which is American global supremacy and Israeli Middle East supremacy. And so I grew very disenchanted with that, and started writing about other things. And out of this grew my book about the Western intervention in Yugoslavia, and in particular the NATO bombing campaign of 1999, which in many ways has really been the paradigm for all subsequent Western military interventions. Iraq, Libya, Syria, they all really stem from that. From what happened in Yugoslavia in the 90s, a deliberate misinterpretation of what was going on in these particular countries, and then for an accelerated propaganda campaign, which leads to sanctions and eventually to direct military intervention, and then to chaos, crisis, broken countries, which then justify subsequent Western military interventions. So I kind of transitioned from a kind of, I suppose, a kind of conservative anti-communism into a definite sort of, anti-conservatism today.
Well, that's fascinating. I was going to ask you about that. Your anti-communism probably stemmed from growing up in Hungary. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. You're born in Hungary, in communist Hungary, and then you come to England, so you naturally are anti-communist. And so and there was really, at the time, I mean, you really could see that there was not that much to defend communism. But now, of course, in retrospect, whatever the flaws of communism, it's clear that, in the name of anti-communism, too many of us were blind to the flaws of capitalism and of the anti-communist ideology. And that is something that we now live with, the anti-communist ideology, which has now become this sort of Russophobic ideology. And of course, all the flaws of capitalism are now have been exacerbated, particularly as there's now no longer a kind of a communist socialist competitor on the scene. So that, because during the Cold War era, there was a competitor on the scene. And so the capitalists had to be a little bit careful. They couldn't just simply throw people out of work and just cut people's wages, because there was always this alternative in the wings. Now, unfortunately, you don't really have that. And so, we live in a world in which socialism is just a dirty word. It's like, we're supposed to just hate socialism. As Donald Trump said recently, socialism has failed everywhere.
Yeah.
And that's now, the official doctrine.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Without getting too deeply into the origins of the Cold War, if we can superficially talk about the period right after the Second World War, the U.S. was pretty much the only undamaged participant in that war, and had profited economically enormously. The depression that had preceded the war was gone because of the military industry, and there was real fear in the U.S. that there would be another depression again. And they realized how much the economy was dependent on the military industry. Unfortunately, 70 years later, I think much of the American economy still dependent on the military. So they need to go and find enemies, obviously, to keep it going. So the Cold War, in many ways, was constructed or stirred up by the West. We can go into Allen Dulles and his appropriating Nazis and whatnot to help stir up problems with the Soviets, etc. But when the Cold War ended, this period is really interesting, because this is when you had your transformation. You seemed surprised that you'd been led astray, or that there was something fraudulent about the anti-communist movement or the governments of the West, because at that moment, just like at the end of the Second World War, when the U.S. was the only intact nation, if they were really truly interested in bringing some kind of social progress around the world, they had an opportunity to do that. And instead, they found themselves basically left with an empire, maybe inadvertently with a world empire, because of all these bases around the world and where their troops were, and that they were amongst the victors, and they nowhere suffered as the Soviet Union did, of course, which was more responsible than anyone for beating the Nazis, as we know. But they were in no position right after the war to have the kind of influence around the world the U.S. did. And yet, instead of using that position, the U.S. created a dominant economic and military empire that helped their own interests of upper circles of our society to become more powerful. And at the end of the Cold War, Bill Clinton, there was all this talk about the peace dividend, that now that the Cold War was over, we could start spending money on social programs in the U.S., and we could reduce the military spending, and that again did not happen. So tell me a little bit more about what was it that made you go through that interesting transformation when you realized, in a way, you'd been duped, and now you turned against the U.S. policy, whereas before you had supported it.
That's right. Well, precisely because of that, as you said, there was the peace dividend. So we said, well, now that the Cold War is over, now that this great adversary is no longer, you think, okay, great. I mean, the Soviet Union with Gorbachev and then Yeltsin said, communism is over. That's it. We're no longer subscribed to the communist doctrine. We are giving up our military alliances. We're giving up on the Warsaw Pact. And then the Soviet Union itself dissolved. Now, if ever there's a signal for America to say, well, I think it's time to wind up our military alliance, and it's time to divert all this vast resources to all our domestic shortcomings, and they're pretty serious. That was it. But instead, what we got was an expansion of NATO. It was as if overnight, the US leaders decided this is our one great chance to build an overwhelming American empire. So, and all these countries from which the Soviets withdrew when they didn't have to withdraw, they withdrew voluntarily. All of this we're now just going to scoop up. And so within, in no time at all, they already scooped up Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Then, we had the next wave of the NATO expansion, and then we had another one. And so this extraordinary expansion, and you would have to think they had to have known that it was only going to provoke a Russian reaction, because how else would any leader of Russia look upon this expansion as other than a threat? And if you remember, in 2008, George W. Bush actually was pushing his NATO partners to get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. I mean, this is the very heartland of Russia. I mean, this is the Russians regard Ukraine as pretty much their own kith and kin, and this is what George W. was pushing for. So this was clearly an aggressive attempt by the United States to scoop up they can, and therefore basically push Russia out of Europe altogether, because that was also coincided with the various agitations in the Muslim autonomous republics within Russia, when you had the wars in Chechnya, which without question were being supported by the United States. So the attempt was just simply to break Russia up, push whatever is left of it into Asia. This was an extraordinarily reckless and aggressive act. So there was that, and part of this act was also the Western expansion into the Balkans. So so we had, first of all, Germany stepped in, and in an extraordinary action that they took, just recognizing the independence of Croatia and Slovenia without any attempt to negotiate any terms of exit. They just rushed in and said, "Yeah, we recognize you as independent state." And then you had the United States that just rushed in and said, "Well, we're going to recognize Bosnia," and so as if we're not going to be left out of it. We're going to recognize Bosnia, even though that a vast majority of that population had no intention of wanting to be as independent states. And of course, that had the inevitable effect of triggering a civil war. So these reckless, aggressive acts really, shaped the subsequent 25 years.
You said more or less it was Kosovo in '99 that turned you, but did you begin?
No, I think even before that. I think the Bosnia intervention. Yeah,
what about what was going on in Russia in the '90s? You said Russia would react, but Yeltsin didn't react. Yeltsin was on board with the Western project 100%. So did you recognize that? Did you recognize that Russia was being asset stripped by local oligarchs in alliance with Wall Street, basically? And you saw that happening too. That started to change your idea.
Absolutely. I mean, if you watched, just this week we had the 25-year anniversary of Yeltsin storming the Russian parliament.
Right.
I mean, and what was extraordinary about that is that Yeltsin was clearly acting illegally. He was basically ruling by executive orders. He was ignoring the will of parliament. He was ignoring the will of the constitutional court. He storms the parliamentary building. How is this portrayed in the West? This is a victory for democracy. This is democracy. The people who were being killed were legislators. They were elected legislators. And they were killed by somebody who was just ruling by executive order. And he had the full endorsement of the Clinton administration. And of course, the Western media were just laughing all this up.
By executive order, and maybe in more stark ways than any Soviet leader had done since Stalin. Maybe.
Yeah.
Since Stalin. And yet this just fits into the entire story that American leaders and through their media tell us, that they are against dictatorships, but only when they don't like the dictatorships. When they're on their side, they're Democrats. So then Kosovo came along, and at that point you realized that there was something seriously wrong with this Western story, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That capitalism, they had not brought freedom and democracy, that they were spreading something else. And
that's right.
Then in 2010, with much of the world and many Americans still to this day believing that their leaders are spreading democracy, comes WikiLeaks. That begins to expose the innards. What is really going on? What diplomats really say to one another? What leaders have said to one another? What American military was doing in trying to bring democracy to Iraq? What did the immediate impact have on you of WikiLeaks in furthering your understanding of what you call American empire?
Well, just look at how WikiLeaks exposed the American machinations in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So while the media was presenting this as, whoa, this is Nuremberg, these bad man Milosevic was being put on trial, fine jurists and great legal minds were weighing the evidence in a scrupulous fashion. Of course, none of it was true. Anyone who was watching the trial could have seen that none of this was happening. But what WikiLeaks exposed is that the Americans were ferociously campaigning in the background to ensure that this trial was controlled, manipulated from start to finish, and that and no attempt be on the part of Milosevic, that Milosevic be allowed to present a fair case, that this would be from start to finish simply a prosecution case in which Milosevic will be cast as the sort of the Adolf Eichmann sitting there in his glass booth with his head sunk, and they were just putting direct pressure. So this was supposedly this independent tribunal, and U.S. diplomats were openly colluding with tribunal officials and prosecutors, and it's all there. It's in WikiLeaks. So just read all those papers of their meetings with prosecutors, getting briefed by prosecutors as to exactly what was going on in the trial, what evidence was presented, what Milosevic's health was, all what kind of medical examinations that he was undertaking. All of this was being handed over to the U.S. diplomats.
And this came out, yeah.
And this is all in WikiLeaks. You can just go to WikiLeaks today and just put in, Milosevic trial, and you'll get all of this information about how the prosecutors and the U.S. diplomats were actually colluding in that trial.
What's interesting is he died, of course, in 2006 on suspicion that he may have been poisoned in prison. And then WikiLeaks came out with this around what time? Do you remember when that? This
was the 2010. That was the cable.
2010.
Yeah, 2010.
Now,
exactly.
Since WikiLeaks came out with those documents, that court exonerated very quietly Milosevic from all the crimes that he was accused of.
He
said he was not guilty. Right. That was buried, of course, on page 23A of the New York Times under a lingerie ad, probably.
That's right. But, exactly. No one knows.
If you think the WikiLeaks releases had anything to do with them having to come out to court and exonerate him, what do you think?
Well, I think it could well be. I mean, it's the trial was itself. If you follow, the trial itself was a dismal failure. I mean, they threw everything at him, except bar the kitchen sink. And I think they actually did throw the kitchen sink at him. He was supposed to be responsible for everything that happened, or everything terrible that happened in Yugoslavia, starting from 1987 on. And they proved very little of it. And certainly, if one looks at what WikiLeaks showed, basically it confirmed what any objective observer would have confirmed, which is Milosevic was a reasonable statesman who was trying to minimize Serbia's military involvement. I mean, he was trying to avoid getting involved in the wars in Bosnia, involved in Croatia, and he wanted to work out some kind of modus vivendi on Kosovo. And I think that's clearly exposed by WikiLeaks, that he was not the demon monster that the Western media presented him. Yeah, exactly, the Hitler of his day, which was, during the 90s, he was the Hitler.
Wait a minute, that was also Noriega, and that was also Saddam, and that was also now Putin. So this is the U.S. still reliving World War II. They'd have to maintain this fiction that they are protecting the world.
That's right. Exactly. And it's the same model. It's always Hitler. Yeah. It's always Hitler, and it's always babies. I mean, somebody's always massacring babies.
Well, that goes back to World War I with the Germans and the
Exactly. And all the way down to Donald Trump's The Beautiful Babies.
And let's not forget the babies thrown out of the incubators in Kuwait.
Thrown out of the incubator. And then recently, Karen Pierce, the British ambassador to the UN, said about there are more babies in Idlib than terrorists.
Right.
The babies.
Well, George, I think Mehdi's going to join us now, but I just wanted to thank you for spending this time with us. And I did want
to talk to you again.
In your work, in your writings, how much have you relied on WikiLeaks? Did you write it in your
a great deal. A great deal. I mean, it is an extraordinary, it's an invaluable resource because it is a true archive. It's so he provides information as an archive. It's annotated. It's easy to access. It's indexed. It's cross references. So you can really use it. This is very different from the kind of leaks that the mainstream media rely on, because the mainstream media rely on leaks that interested bureaucrats leak to the media in order to win political points against their bureaucratic rivals. That's not what WikiLeaks does. WikiLeaks actually provides serious information for in the public interest about what rulers are doing. It's not about so that the guy in the Defense Department is going to score some points against the guy in the State Department.
Exactly. Well, thank you, George. And now you're going to interview Mehdi. So speak to you again next time, hopefully.
Yeah, okay, good to see you, Joe.
Okay, bye.
Hey, Mayday.